I'm Rohini Pande and I'm moderating the last session. I'm a colleague of Matt's here and a great admirer of his work in this book, so it's very nice to be here. So this session has a very broad title called Useful Evaluation. I gather many of the discussions in the day have already led people to have different views on what useful evaluation is. So what we were going to do was have first Burb and then Lant talk for 20 minutes each on useful evaluation, and then I'm going to exploit the opportunity I have as chair to first make a few comments and pose questions to them and then leave it open to the broader audience. So let me start by inviting Bob Klipguard, who's here from Claremont Graduate University, and as many of you know, he's really done a lot of seminal work, especially on corruption and governance, and so let's hear how maybe tropical gangsters can benefit from useful evaluation.
That's a good question. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And how many of you are students of policy analysis and evaluation here? Public policy? Any of you? Okay. Many of you, right? And some of you are practitioners of it. So I thought I would talk about that. I want to locate part of Matt's book, which with Lant and Michael is becoming very well known around the world, a process for trying to engage people in iterative adaptation, focusing on real problems, as opposed to taking a study and doing what it says or following a best practice, trying to do something that's more like a problem-solving thing. And the general theme I have is consistent with something I said this morning. I think many of the things we do in governance and public administration and so forth are weaker than they should be because we remain confined to our disciplinary quarters. We still read too much of our own field, and we don't think, what is our problem like? Is the problem, for example, of developing measures of governance something like the problem of developing measures of GDP or intelligence or happiness? Answer, yes. Are there lessons from those areas that would help us avoid problems of premature generalization or premature shutting off of channels in this area? Or take the case that Marilee talked about this morning, which was the question of there are tremendous amounts of individual differences which seem to belie the notion of general rules that can, or recipes, or rules of thumb that could be applied, or checklists that could be applied across cases. And we get in the governance area, is that a little bit like the problem of public health or education where there are tremendous amounts of individual differences? Are there things we can learn from how they attack that problem there which would help us with her 5 questions at the end, which left us a little bit in a kind of existential and epistemological limbo? And so it goes for the day. I think there's a general lesson there, and I want to talk about that with regard to this process of problem solving. And I want to locate it within a movement which is defined by this metaphor: the evidence-based decision-making. There's a decision maker who has to decide something, and she needs evidence to decide that. And the evidence should help discern which of a number of alternatives on the table have what kinds of benefits and costs, including all the implementation and political challenges. So the complete policy analysis. Right? Now, evidence-based is one of the nom de guerre right now in so many fields. For example, there's evidence-based management, as in this article from the Harvard Business Review, or this book, the Oxford Handbook of Evidence-Based Management. And it gets, of course, it's very popular in health. You go on the websites in health, you see all these areas where they're trying to figure out what works for which kinds of people in which kinds of diseases given certain kinds of demographic contexts. And there's even evidence-based sports medicine. For those of you who like me, can hardly wait to get out of here to see the Red Sox tonight. There's sign of enhanced supply of evidence provision in our field. I don't know if you know, next month there'll be a seminar at Stanford. Maybe you're going to attend, Frank, at the Stanford Journal. What's that one called, of public social innovation? We're having a seminar next month where they're going to talk about 3 game changers in evaluation. One of them is Michael Quinn Patton's so-called developmental evaluation, which if you haven't seen it, looks a little bit like PDIA or 7 other versions of this participatory diagnosis, the use of information to set agendas and to figure out what the problem is, and not just to say this worked this well here. Shared measurement and big data are two others, which they claim are game changers in evaluation. There's also a recent paper by Clements and de Montbinis, which talks about 3 revolutions in development economics, some of which have to do with evaluation, and it have to do with the greater availability of data. And they talk about a revolution in development economics. There are also many examples from this conference. I'm impressed by, for example, we didn't get to hear from Frank about his important books about political order over the centuries and the political philosophy and where things go, but when's your new one coming out, the new version? Next year. So these are important for us to contextualize all these questions that we're talking about, dealing with very important but short-term problems compared to the magisterial sweep that Frank gives it. The whole randomized controlled trials thing, we didn't hear much about that today. I hope you'll make some remarks about that, but it's extremely important development for figuring out what works where. The case studies idea, Michael has got he's advocated that maybe this problem of external validity from this setting to that, the theoretical bridge, could be built by means of case studies. You saw Jennifer's powerful use of case studies in her Princeton program. And problem-driven iterative adaptation and other techniques are also extremely promising and seem to, for the optimists among us, to promise, if not a revolution in development economics, at least something better and different about evaluation, so that 5 years from now, when we have a follow-up to this, we'll be able to celebrate all this progress. There's also demand. Sign of enhanced demand. I don't know if you saw the 2013 budget of the U.S. government before bedtime reading. It's a good thing if you need melatonin or something. This will put you right to sleep. Hey, Richard. There's a whole cult there of evidence-based policy making. You've probably seen a couple of recent books in England with that title, Evidence-Based Policy Making, Evidence Infrastructure. There was a recent conference at the UN about the post-2015 agenda in development, and one blogger said the biggest surprise was this emphasis on evidence. The statisticians got together and said, statisticians unite. I love that, don't you? Factor analysis forever. Right? And then the focus on evidence could transform development. So here's the supply side with all these promising developments. And then there's the demand side, which, for example, has statements like this. This is about 6 years old, and from one of these Clinton conferences, where they lament, it's a standard trope, so much money is spent, there's so much need, and yet we don't know what works. If only we did, we would do so much better. Okay? So that's the demand side. So here's all the supply side of evaluation with all these great developments. Here's the demand side. So, unfortunately, we have a lot of examples that when the analysis is there, it's not used. So a classic lament from the evaluators comes here. Most studies appear to come and go without leaving any discernible mark on the problem. Okay, so we have to ask the question, if there is this acute need for better information about what works, and if there are these supply-side techniques, for example, the Zeckhauser article in the JPAM a couple of years ago, which has a wonderful framework for how to do policy analysis, what the key issues are for doing it. So what is the problem? Why is there this big gap? Okay. Now, in the diagnosis of the gap, one recent example is a National Academy of Sciences study about useful social sciences. And it says, well, you know, the gap is still there. It was noted in 1988, the last time this was reviewed. And it's still there because we haven't yet applied all the social science we know about complex adaptive systems, decision-making processes, both organizational and individual. And if only we had that knowledge added into the other things we need to do, then that wonderful leap from what works there to what will work here would be occasioned. However, the report provides not a single example that would show you, aha, that really happens. It's just an argument for plausibility. So the question is why? And in the literature, we have two kinds of reasons. You've seen the supply side reasons. It's not there on time, it's not good enough, the data aren't good, the models aren't appropriate, it overlooks unintended consequences, etc. And while we're whipping ourselves for these faults of practice, so then we also look at the policymakers and notice that they're too busy or too biased. Or Lant's got a very nice article about why, in general, those providing programs don't want them evaluated. You know, there's a lot of reasons why there's bad incentives on the part of the providers of the services for not to avoid evaluation. And yet, here's a proposition for you. There are examples of policy research that makes a big difference. So a few years back, when I was dean at the Rand Graduate School, I got together the heads of our major research programs, over $200 million a year, in everything from health to education to crime to defense and so forth, and asked them, so what are some of the all-stars here at Rand? What are the best things we've done in terms of policy analysis and evaluation that's really made a difference? And guess what the first response was? What do you mean made a difference? Right, good. Good. And so I would say, what do you mean made a difference? You're the head of the health program. What do you think made a difference? Well, that occasioned good conversations among these folks. What did make a difference and what were the examples? And so Susan Everingham and I looked at about 30 nominees for these things. And we talked to the users, as well as read the sort of the craft quality of the work. We also looked at users, and we picked about 15 and taught a second-year master class for policy analysis, which I urge you to think about as you're developing your class here. Thursday, you'd get, we met Tuesdays and Thursdays, you'd get a kind of pseudo RFP, which the students would go off and work on over the weekend and deliver us a 2-page thing that says, if you had $1 million to study this problem, what would you do? Who do you want your team? And you give us that on Monday night, and the researchers who did the study come to class. And it's an hour-and-a-half class. The first 45 minutes, we hear your ideas, and then the second 45 minutes, the researchers talk about, that's it, interesting, here's what we did, and here's what we would have done, blah, blah, blah. Then and only then you get the study, and you go home and read it. And by Wednesday night, that's only one day, you have to write one page saying what you liked best about the study. Appreciative inquiry. And what you would have done if you had another $1 million. Okay? That avoids the critique mentality. Well, it should have had a bigger sample size. And what was its instrument? Okay. So you get to something more laudatory. And it actually went from week to week, from health to education to all these different examples. And we discovered some interesting things. Oh, by the way, we followed this up with a conference with 7 international think tanks that came to Rand with their 7 choices. And of course, I had the same conversation with them. In Indonesia, you've been working on this for a long time, what have been the examples of what do you mean made a difference? What do you mean made a difference? And we had very interesting from all parts of the world presenting their examples. And here are some of the lessons we learned. First, success in policy analysis seldom is viewed via that dominant metaphor of the decision maker with the alternatives making the choice where the study says, hey boss, do B. Benefits this, costs that, implementation problems here, politics here, scope, and all those things that, you get all that stuff and the guy did it and it worked. I think we found 2 that looked like that. And yet the studies made a difference. Now, let's take a look at the categories of making a difference. First of all, they helped redefine the problem. I didn't realize this was an insurance problem. I didn't realize this was a problem of latent variables with multiple imperfect indicators in general. You did, of course, but that's an example. Clarify and expand the objectives. The static problem assumes the objective function is given. Actually, many times these studies would remind people of the objective they forgot about. Amplifying the objectives, and that suddenly they go, oh my goodness, we didn't think of that. They would enhance the alternatives. There was an alternative 3, but maybe alternative 4 was, think of this as an insurance problem. Find an insurance premium analogy. They also did something else which now gets me to Matt's book and something in Lant's and Michael's work. They did something else which they bring together the quote stakeholders and they provide them with an opportunity to work through the problems, not only to specify the equation by identifying the context by policy interactions in ways that no outsider could, but also to facilitate creative problem solving. Okay? Not just the statistics problem, but also the inventiveness problem. And also to forge long-term relationships across those stakeholders, which then persisted beyond the study and sometimes made the biggest difference. Which led to this creative problem-solving idea. So that's connected to your work right now. So let me tell you what I've given you an example of this from the Philippines. You may have seen this phrase, but maybe in English, where there's no corruption, there'll be no poverty. This was the campaign slogan of Benigno Aquino III when he ran for president in the Philippines in 2010. He won a landslide election, and then They had to think, well, what do we do here about that? Aside from what the president did, was I'm starting a website, a inaugural address, you guys let me know if you've seen corruption. And he gave the finance minister the job of monitoring this. The guy, I saw this guy a couple weeks later, 3 weeks later, he said, I got 1,500 complaints. What do I do now? Good question. What do you do now? So they had a convening at Malacanang Palace, the first full cabinet meeting after they took office. It was on a Saturday. And here's what they did. See if the PDIA guys like this. But you'll see the procedure. First of all, a statistical picture of where you stand in a variety of measures of competitiveness and governance from very imperfect measures. And they show up some things that Philippines looks very good at, and some things it looks very bad at. It turns out all the very bad ones are consistent with the president's mandate, that in fact it's the bad governance, corruption, ineffectiveness, etc., a variety of measures of those things where we really lag compared to many other macro policies where we're doing pretty well. Second, we looked at a case study from another country of something that worked. No country is the same as the Philippines, but the case study was presented in a way you'd recognize here, except taking advantage of a fact about busy cabinet ministers. They won't read a case in advance. Forget it. So you do a technique called the live case, which aficionados of the Rorschach test will also appreciate. It enables them to project their country onto an alien case in a way that's not threatening. Because now they can say what those guys ought to do without having to say what we ought to do, because that's a little too close to home. And the ministers, after getting part A, what would you do if you were this new administration in this country? They go off for 45 minutes, mixed up in groups at 4, come back with their ideas, then they see what actually happened, and they are energized by this. They sometimes say, well, Colombia is not the same as the Philippines. But the second thing they say is, but it's very interesting how they did this first, and how they mobilized these resources here, and how about they neutralize the opposition doing this, and how about getting some quick result in 6 months people could see, and how about a variety of things that they take away. And then we look at some analytical frameworks. So data to locate us, real examples of something that works in an area where many people don't think anything works. We've given up on a lot of these hard problems, the wicked problems. We don't, not only do we not have big, hairy, audacious goals, we don't have any goals at all. We're just going to say, let's leave that on the side and give a speech about it. The third one is some sort of analytical framework which takes this problem out of the realm of ethics and laws and into something actually much more practical. I won't go into the details of this, but the results were that they came up by the next Tuesday. They had an outline, and then they gave that to the president. They went off and developed it. I went back a little over a year later, and it was awesome. We had, this time, a very highly publicized meeting because the president was very proud of their progress here. We now had 38 cabinet ministers, sub-cabinet ministers, and so forth, the television cameras and everything else. It went for another day. And one of the things that came out of that was 6 working groups. One of the working groups you guys will like, we're talking about NGOs, Jennifer's gone, was how all these organizations that were there monitoring from the ground up, which is impressive in the Philippines, did not have any business plans. I met for a day with all of them. They don't have any business plans. They have no capital funding, for example. Everything is hand-to-mouth, and everything is based on volunteer behavior. And it's very difficult to sustain that over the long term. Here's another example from Clayton Christensen, as you know, a famous management professor across the river. And Clayton was once asked by Andy Grove to come to Intel and apply his theory of disruptive technologies to that industry. So he got paid a lot of money, I'm sure, to go do this. And there's a board meeting, and all the senior staff and the board, and here comes Christensen. And he starts off, he decides, I'm not going to talk about Intel. I'm going to tell a story about another place, another industry, where I'm going to tell a story that's theory-loaded, right? But I'm going to tell the story about the disruptive technology. And as he got going, about halfway through, Grove interrupted him and said, wait a second, I've got this. Do you guys have this? Of course, nobody said no. And then they went off and analyzed their industry with what they'd already pulled out of Christensen's framework from the other story. And here's what Christensen's lesson was. It had a profound effect on me. When people ask what I think they should do, I rarely answer their question directly. Instead, I run the question aloud through one of my models. I'll describe how the process in the model worked its way through an industry quite different from their own. And then more often than not, they'll say, okay, I get it. And they'll answer their own question more insightfully than I could have. You've probably seen the idea of, I'm going to question the idea of the decision maker making that choice. You may have seen work by Susskind and company with their consensus building, where the idea is to get many stakeholders at the table and think through choices, because oftentimes it's not a one person, one choice problem. It's really a complicated series of decisions, if you will, across different sectors and different agencies. And then there's more than the choice. You may know the methodology developed by Don Berwick here when he was here about measuring, and when they take quality of care measures and try to implement them in other health systems. I did this with the mayors in Mindanao once, and it worked beautifully. Basically, you get everybody to come with convening number one. You give them these things. The mayors, in my case, the night before they left, they all worked on the strategy, mayor and their staff, 4 or 5 people for each city, 7 cities. They all worked on what they're going to do when they go back in the next 6 months. Not 100 days, could have been 100 days, but it was longer than that. Then they share that the next day and hear each other's comments. And then part of the deal, though, is if you want to come to convening 1, you've got to agree to come to convening 2, which in our case was a year later in Mindanao. And these guys got together and shared what had happened. Here's what we did, here's what worked. That didn't work for you, it worked for me. Here's how it worked for me. I came there, I didn't do anything. I was the figurehead, I was the stuffed Bentham that was letting things go on because they'd all come together, and now we're sharing their results and learning from each other. More than the choice. So here's my hypothesis. First of all, I think as policy researchers, to do useful evaluation, we can provide data to help locate the problem in the setting, case studies of success, and analytical frameworks, if you will, models, if you will, theories, if you will, program theories or program logics. You use the word there you'd like. And we can get people together to have them use that information with multiple actors and then follow up this thing with something else. You can imagine linking people on the web. You can imagine after the 100 days having people get newsletters all the time from whoever's coordinating this thing. You can imagine Harvard University having these things be regularized. So this leads me to suggest policy analysis and evaluation 2.0. Remember, the first version is the decision maker with that choice, where the objective function is given, well-defined alternatives, good data, and accepted models. And there's a lot of challenges to doing this kind of work. All of the experimental work depends on a lot of very hard work here to collect the right data and do the right modeling and get the right counterfactuals. Similarly with the econometrics work you can imagine here, very difficult to do. And then we provide a report to whoever the decision maker is. Now with version 2.0, we have many decision makers and stakeholders, not always, but I'm saying many important cases, who don't have a choice, but they have many choices. Indeed, the objectives, alternatives, and data are unclear or imperfect or incomplete. They're what in the heuristics literature are called big problems instead of small problems, where we don't just need the evidence, we need something that will kindle creative problem solving. So it's not the automatic inference from this work to Norway, so do it. It's something quite different. And then it's not the report anymore, it's some sort of event and networking process. And so I'm arguing this is a new way to think about what we do, about what useful policy analysis and research looks like in evaluation. Now there are some implications for this. For those of you who are students, when you do your study, it doesn't mean you throw out the careful econometric evaluation of alternatives or estimating the effect size of something through a quasi-experiment. Doesn't mean that at all. It just means you, after you do that work, you ask a few other questions. In doing this work, in doing this dissertation, if you will, doing this PAE, did I learn anything about helping people redefine the problem here? Are they stuck in a rhetorical loop where my work can help break them out of it? Can I help them rethink what the objectives are here? Did something come up in my work that really expands the idea of the objective function, or suggests new alternatives people might think about? Is there a way that my work can be used to convene different actors to think about this? And is there a way that I could imagine using my work to build relationships among key stakeholders which could persist after my study is on the university microfilms? Now, convening has its own issues. And this is where I address this to Michael and Lana. Lana, I'm looking forward to your ideas today. They have a procedure which has 4 big principles in it. which are very similar to the principles that I would use, but also very similar to ideas that you'd find in things like Hans Blindenbacher's work or Judith Innes's work in urban planning, a variety of other things where there's some sort of collaborative problem solving going on. There's an older literature going back 25 or 30 years where some economists tried to get together with this. They had Tom Schelling and go off and think about what is the decision-making process, how would we use information in that. So we really don't have, I don't think, the scientific knowledge yet to say this. The temptation is for me to say, all these problems are different, but my process is really good, it'll apply to all the problems. Somebody comes along and says, isn't that also contextually, in other words, we go up one logical level of uncertainty. If this is contextually driven, you can't guarantee a best result. Is the 100-day problem also contextually contingent? And if so, do we get, you can imagine the problems there. But my proposition is, in 5 or 10 years, we're going to know a lot more about this. So when we get together again, we'll be able to say a lot more about, in these situations, these kinds of problems, these kinds of information flows and networking can make these kinds of differences. Now I have 2 recommendations for those who presented today. Apart from the meta recommendation that we get beyond our public administration governance area to think about what's our problem like elsewhere and draw in inspiration from other places. First of all is to find good examples as well as theory. And second, to think even harder than we are already about what if the policymakers we're working with are not really desiring change. They're not really wanting to make a decision. They're trying to avoid a decision or pretend to be doing a decision for a variety of good and bad reasons. What happens if their capacity to think about these things is very limited? Now what do we do? So let's take the first one first. You may have seen this wonderful book called Made to Stick by a Stanford marketing professor and his brother. And it had a mnemonic device at the end for what kinds of things we are hardwired to remember. It's not the elegant presentation which afterwards people go, wow, that was a great presentation. And you ask the next day, what did he say again? Oh, I can't remember. I just remember it was really good. What people remember are the mnemonic, summarized by the mnemonic of success. Specific, not general. Unexpected, not conventional. Concrete, credible, emotional stories. Telling examples. That's why I love what Jennifer Widener and her colleagues are doing so much. That's why the Harvard Business School has so much success following the Harvard Law School way back when with the case method, trying to bring real examples that grab people and are presented in ways that grab people in surprising ways that they then don't forget. So the examples we need, I find in the literature in public administration, we need more examples. Michael, I'll start with you. And in your example of the need for case studies to support theory, you don't give an example of that happening. So in other words, I believe it, but now, wow, it'd be so much stronger if you said, for example, in section 5, I'm going to give you an example of how these cases really did bridge the gap from it worked here to it might work there. Typologies of policy issues. Lant and others are working on the question, can we, and others have done this too, a real complicated problem, a real simple problem, a real mechanical problem. You know, there's a bunch of variables that heuristics literature has some categories here. Where these kind would translate pretty well across everywhere. Double entry bookkeeping is probably a good idea everywhere, but this way of organizing a campaign may not be good everywhere. So we've got a beginning there, but what I'd love to see is an example where here are 5 kinds of examples where it transfers quite well, and here are the examples to prove that. Here are 10 kinds that doesn't go very well. Another one is PDIA. I've been reading that as an aficionado and as I think you can see an ally. And yet I don't yet get it. I don't yet see the examples that show me what's inside that thing. But I find it completely plausible. Policymakers thinking. I just read this Nancy Cartwright book, if you've seen it, called Evidence-Based Policymaking. And at crucial points in the book, it's almost ludicrous. She says, well, you need all these things before you can conclude that this study in India would be applicable in Bangladesh. And by the way, I've got a cautionary tale that one time it wasn't. Right? So then you need all these things, and there's no formula for that. There's no way to do that except to ask policymakers to think. Great, thank you. Can you give me a good example of where they thought and what exactly they did? No, there's no examples in there. And finally, I'm very interested in the question of you've probably seen the Gawande book, The Checklist Manifesto. Wonderful book. Also with the heuristics literature, where it turns out precisely when the problems are complicated and there's not enough data, is where we need simple rules. So-called, this literature claims that, where you'd think it would be the opposite. You can't possibly have a rule of thumb or a simple best practice because this thing is so different. And actually they're showing that these kinds of decision rules sometimes do much better with complicated problems. Well, we need examples of these things in action. I think Rwanda provides a lot of good examples. I could give you some from Peru that are very interesting, from a thing called Ciudadanos al Día. You can follow that up, Ciudadanos al Día. You can follow that website and you'll see how they've developed lists of best practices, over 1,000 good practices, buenas prácticas, and then documented checklists based on those practices which they can easily adopt in different cities, clinics, and agencies. So, what if we don't have the problem, what if we have the challenge of a willing reform-minded government that is quite knowledgeable about the local context, the Philippines, the one I described earlier. Those guys want reform. They know all about the local context. What they need is some inspiration from outside. How big a problem is this? What are examples of things that work somewhere else? What are some frameworks to help me get going? And then they take off. Okay, so that's terrific. That's a good question. But here's the problem with many of the countries we're working in. In fact, the places that seem to need the analysis the most, that need the foreign aid the most, are characterized by not necessarily reform-minded governments and not necessarily knowledgeable about local context. Sometimes they're urban elites who have no clue what's going on in the healthcare system or the justice system because they don't experience it, even the economic system. And I think this is a first-order problem for us. I have some hints about it, but I'll just make one suggestion, two suggestions. First of all, when I work with governments, there are many of them I don't work with because I feel that this situation is so severe, I don't do it. And yet you'll see in Tropical Gangsters too, I've been working in places like East Timor and South Sudan, hardly paragons of capacity, right? Right now I'm working in Pakistan. I give that about a 10% chance of improvement, don't quote me on that, but very difficult context. So some of these places I'm not going to go. But other times I find that political will is endogenous. It's not something that is given from outside. It's something that when you interact with those guys and you show them some things that have worked somewhere else, you mean we can do that here? Oh, I mean it's possible? Let's think about that. Let's not give up too soon. So if the first part is the incapacity, the second part is the context in which Matt's book is written is about foreign aid or lending. And there's a donor that Matt's really talking to because he's an insider and an outsider talking about reforming the procedures of this interaction between the donor government and the recipient, or the donor agency and the recipient government. And the challenge is there, if this government is recalcitrant or corrupt, then you have a principal agent problem that may demand a simple rule, may demand a best practice like orientation to at least get something on paper which they're committed to, as opposed to the muddling through bricolage, whatever other French word we might want to add to this thing, which sounds very nice, and the iterative adjustment over time. Sometimes with these governments, precisely there is where you don't want to have iterative adjustments over time. Precisely there we need to learn lessons from this 100-day situation where concrete targets, even if not optimal, even if externally imposed, may, I'm not saying always, may be necessary given the difficulty of the principal agent problem in the face of recalcitrant and corrupt people. Let me stop there and hope to get your thoughts during after Lant does his devilish work up here.
I'll now hand over to Lant to give his views. Lant, 20 minutes.
So, I'm coming from a student event in which I was dressed. I didn't dress specifically for this occasion, but I thought it might be helpful because I think I'm going to play a role somewhere in between being devil's advocate and the devil. But I want to start, given that I'm the devil, although this is probably how the devil would start, with, I was born in 1959. In almost every conceivable way to a progressive person, the world is night and day better today than in 1959. So if we look at the developing world, in the 1950s, the average child was unlikely to be in any schooling at all. And now the average years of schooling in the developed world is above where it was in the developed world in the 1960s. It's 7 years. So massive expansions in basic schooling. Health indicators of every type, but in particular child mortality, have just plummeted during my lifetime. From where, you know, over 200 child mortality was probably routine in many parts of the developing world. Many parts of the developing world are under 50 now. So just massive improvements. In spite of our, in some sense, disappointment with 2% growth, we thought maybe we were going to get faster. 2% growth accumulated is a big deal. Most countries are twice as well off in material terms as they were. Moreover, if you look at specific problems, there have been massive improvements on several economic issues. So, for instance, chronic inflation and chronic bouts of hyperinflation was a huge problem, not everywhere, but in lots of places in the 1970s. You know, other than complete basket cases like Zimbabwe, you know, there isn't a place in the world today in which incipient hyperinflation is like the first order policy issue. On the basics of like openness to the world and that goods can kind of move across borders with, if not some obstacles, but with some, you know, the default assumption is that goods can move across borders night and day to what the world was, even in the 1970s, right? Moreover, if you look at the United States relative to 1959, things that were routine in the way that race was discussed and treated, the relationship among individuals to different races in the United States, night and day. Not to say the world's perfect now, but night and day different. The way in which the environment is incorporated into routine decision-making, night and day different than 1959. The way in which gender issues are treated, night and day different than 1959. Okay? Now, so the world's night and day better in nearly every regard. So, that's a good thing, right? Now, one point of that is that if one said, geez, we now somehow believe that more rigorous evidence and evaluation is essential to progress, one might ask oneself the question of how you came to that view. Was it a considered view based on the evidence of where we did and did not make progress, showing that there was dramatically more randomized evaluation in gender issues and non-gender issues, and that's why we made progress in gender and not in other domains? Is there any evidence that the compelling driving force behind the progress in any of these things was any particular piece or even accumulation of evidence that one would necessarily consider rigorous, or was it people changed their mind on the basis of accumulation of evidence that individually was less than compelling in its bits, but kind of added up to a sea change in the paradigm with which we approached issues? So, you know, I just spoke to some of the members of the class about independent central banks. It was kind of a huge night and day shift in the way the default assumption is that you're going to have an independent central bank. You're kind of a slightly awkward conversation if you're a country without an independent central bank, because it's the way we do things now. You know, can you point to the piece of, you know, rigorous evidence? There was evidence, there were arguments, but it was an argumentation-sustained thing. Okay. Second, I think if we look at where we have been successful and where we haven't been successful, we've been successful by and large in two domains, right? And I have an analytical category, set of categories, but we've been quite successful in domains in which kind of implementation-free elite policy making can carry the day. So if an executive agency can decide to reduce trade barriers, and it actually is implementation reducing because we're not doing things that formerly we would have had capacity to do, we've had tons of progress where executive action can combine with implementation reducing decisions to produce freer markets, right? We've also been quite successful where it's elite policy-making engagement, but it's elite policy-making, like central banking. You know, it really only takes a half a dozen people to maintain a central bank sets of policies that can create at least some dimensions of macroeconomic stability. The fiscal problems are much harder, but the actual monetary policies, it doesn't require like hundreds of thousands of agents. So elite things we've kind of done pretty well on. And we've also done pretty well at the other extreme on logistical things. I lived and worked in Indonesia for a couple of years, and we used to say, in Indonesia, anything an army can do, Indonesia can do, and not coincidentally. Armies tend to be good at logistics, right? I mean, the essence of an army is having an army in a given place at a given time ready to fight, and that requires really complicated logistics. And so anything that required logistical tasks, actually vaccinations of kids, we have universal vaccinations of kids pretty much. And again, there's always, really basket case countries that aren't there, but when you have something that like 85% of the kids in Mali were vaccinated in the year 2000, like, okay, this is something that's kind of being done everywhere, right? So we've been quite successful on logistics, where it's pure logistics, right? So getting kids into school have been enormously successful. Now, when that logistics combines in order to produce a successful service with some discretionary transaction intensive large number of agent requirements of frontline workers for delivery, we've been much, 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 much less good at that. So I think the narrower the set of people you needed to cooperate to sort of make it happen, the better. Or where the large number of people needed to cooperate were kind of logistical. So Jennifer's examples. Is Jennifer still here? Jennifer? No, the other Jennifer, sorry. Anyway. But, Jennifer's examples of routine things like giving a driver's license, it's not universally done very well, but it can be done well. Where we've fallen in between is the things where there necessarily has to be some amount of discretion in implementation, like the difference between getting a kid in school and getting the kid to learn something. So getting a teacher in the classroom, knowing what the child should know, knowing what the child does know, doing some set of things to help that child acquire skills, that has turned out to be an enormously higher so if we look at the variability of progress, there's like zero variability of progress in years of schooling. Every country has expanded schooling by almost exactly the same amount. If you divide countries into democratic and non-democratic, corrupt and non-corrupt, high growth, low growth, they all grew by 5 years. They all had 5 years improvement in the average years of schooling in their population. If you look at the variability in learning inside schools, it's enormous. So some places the kids go to school and learn stuff, other places kids go to school and don't learn stuff. So all of that is, the world is not the development world is not a story of failure, it's a story of success. But it's a story of differential success. And that differential success has led us to where we are today, to where there are fewer and fewer of the easy challenges, which is a great thing, right? It's a great thing we don't have to worry about chronic hyperinflation. It's a great thing, right? That kind of at the margins we don't have to worry about the fact that every bit of foreign exchange in the current economy is rationed by the central bank and we can't get any for anything. That's a great thing, right? It's a great thing that every kid's going to school. But it means that the set of challenges we face going forward are necessarily of an order, are likely to be of an order more difficult than the problems we have solved, because not surprisingly, easy problems got solved before hard problems. Okay. First. Second, the idea that evaluation per se by providing rigorous evidence would be an essential or even relatively important part of improving the development process is an argument that has puzzled me from the beginning. In the sense that in my 30 years of working development, I've seen all kinds of fads come and go, and I have never seen a fad based on less evidence than the fad for more evidence. It's in two senses, right? One is early into this, and by the way, I happen to have been the bank task manager of one of the very first randomized evaluations that the bank financed, and it's, well, not one of the first, but one of the first that by Michael Kramer that became the successor to many others. So I wrote a paper called "It Pays to Be Ignorant." right? And it actually comes from this game show that happened in the United States, but it had a catchy little theme song. It pays to be ignorant, to be dumb, to be dense, to be ignorant. And it was a game show where they asked really simple questions and the contestants gave stupid answers, and it was kind of just for the amusement. It was an anti-quiz show, right? Okay. Now, what was the essence of the model? The model was people who do stuff do it because they believe in it. Right? The world gets changed by people who believe in stuff. Right? And people go out and work for human rights because they believe in human rights. And they go out and they work for universal education because they believe in universal education. And they go out and they do microcredit because they believe in microcredit. Right? So if you come to those people and say, I doubt that what you believe is true, let's work together to provide rigorous evidence that will expose you to the possibility that your core belief is false. No, I don't think so. Will largely be the answer. So I think if I went to the Pope, even the current Pope, and much more so the previous Pope. So let's talk about the previous Pope. Current Pope, I'm not so sure of his papality, but anyway. The old Pope, after all, the old Pope was head of the Inquisition. We kind of knew his views, right? Okay, so we go to the old Pope and say, we can do a randomized evaluation of whether bingo on Tuesday night or bingo on Thursday night increases attendance at the Sunday services and affiliation with the Catholic faith and improves the faith of your parishioners. How about that? Like, oh yeah. Provide me solid evidence about some within technique of like improving my objective. Absolutely on board. If we came to the Pope, old Pope, and said, we're going to do a randomized evaluation that will be persuasive to everyone who reads it is that it's right and compelling of whether or not petitionary prayer works. I'll stick with faith. And I just don't want scientific evidence on that question because it's existential to my belief about who I am and what my organization does. So no organization is going to voluntarily put its existential core beliefs at risk. Or they will only do so under the greatest duress, right? So by and large, we should expect in practice randomized evaluation to be a weapon against the weak. Who will have to do a randomized evaluation? I can guarantee you Social Security, Medicaid, not going to do a randomized evaluation because they have all the political power in the world. I can guarantee you the U.S. military is not going to do a randomized evaluation that puts any of its core existential beliefs at risk. They will do randomized evaluations through RAND Corporation about what's effective for recruiting, but they will not do the randomized evaluation of, is it better to spend $500 billion on defense, or can we get by with 100? If they could prove that question compellingly, they would do anything in their power to prevent that evaluation from happening, and they would win, because they're the military, right? So who's going to do randomized evaluations? The weakest, the most powerless. The people who are desperate. It's like a last chance gamble, right? I will do randomized evaluation only when I have such little political support that, Jesus, maybe it turns out okay and I win, but I'm going to lose anyway, right? So, by and large, I think, you know, the idea that evaluation is a useful tool to decision makers who will use it to choose amongst various things will end up with the decision maker only able to impose the requirement of a randomized evaluation on the weakest of all possible things. And that most decisions will continue to get made in the public sphere through political power and aggregation of constituency. And they will, I mean, in the law specifying, in the law for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, it explicitly forbids the Department of Agriculture from not just randomized rigorous study, but any study about the impact of subsidies paid to farmers. Which is not surprising. It's like, if I have enough power to pass a law to give me a subsidy, I might as well use that power to prevent you from creating a coalition that would take it away. right? And so literally I have had on various occasions calls from the U.S. Department of Agriculture saying, we think we've found a way around, around the prevention of us spending money on the subsidy issue to show that they're like deleterious effects. But they have, the law prevents them from doing it. So, when we ask useful evaluations, we have to ask useful for who, right? And if we want to be useful, and there's a big existential decision, are we trying to be useful for people who are funders of people who are doing stuff, or are we trying to be useful to people who do stuff, right? And mostly, there's one way of viewing evaluation is the way the Ministry of Finance, what the Ministry of Finance wants me to do, so in round 2 they can cut my budget. In which case, you should expect the major problem with randomized evaluations to be that people won't do them. And if they agree to do them ex ante, they will sabotage them in practice. So if you look at the number of randomized evaluations that get launched, it's many, many, many more than the number of randomized evaluations that get completed. Particularly when the randomized evaluator doesn't have control over the intervention. Why? Because the implementing organization sabotages it, because they don't actually want there to be a conclusive result, because the risk of a conclusive result is just higher than the risk of no result usually, and so they'll just sabotage it. Which means the evaluation isn't ever perceived as useful to them, right? So we want a useful evaluation. We should think about useful to who. And what Professor Klipguard is talking about is how are we useful to the people actually doing things versus this meta question of are we providing a decision maker evidence that they would use to turn on or off various levers. Okay. Which leads me to our kind of innovation. We have a paper together with Selena Senji and Jeff Hammer called It's All About Me, right? The benefit of having a paper named It's All About Me is that my wife said, first title you've had that tells the truth. Then I had to point out that it was M-E monitoring experiential learning and evaluation. And it's all about how we, in practice, among the people who are implementing things and want to do the best that they can at the objectives they might have and believe in, how we help them feed back information. What we're trying to do is bring together the monitoring data that's often generated only for fiduciary accountability purposes to be closer to performance data so that we can talk about what are the variety of things we could do. So, ours is a basically encapsulation of what you were just talking about, of how do we take the fact that you're collecting data as you go. Everybody's required to collect all kinds of monitoring data, but it's mostly either not used at all for actual decision-making feedback because it never incorporated in any thoughtful way what will be our decisions in the future, for which it would be great if we actually knew the outcomes, not necessarily causal outcomes on ultimate beneficiaries, but are we getting the job done, right? So have metrics in there. Then you have experiential learning, in which in the best way, and again this talks a lot about what Robert was just talking about, is we start with what we call the design space. We say, what are all the possible things I could do, right? And the thing about the design space is that oftentimes people will say things like, oh, well, conditional cash transfers have been shown to work. It's like, really? Let's say you were actually designing a conditional cash transfer, which is giving some people money in response for doing something else as part of a targeted transfer program. What would be the policy dimensions on which you would have choices? Well, how much is the transfer, right? Already. Could be big, could be small. How do we scale it? Who's the targeted population? Is it the poor? Is it those at risk of the behavior we're conditioning on? Is it expectant mothers? Is it the poor generally? How do we target? Which organization implements it? So after all, if it's a conditional cash transfer conditioned on education, is it implemented by the Department of Education or by the Department of Social Work, by the Department of whatever? Who implements it? Third, how often is it paid? Is it paid once a semester, once a week, once a month? Who is it paid to? Does it go to the head of the household? Does it go to the head of the household that's the mother in the household? Does it, see, who certifies that there's been compliance with the decisions. So who certifies that the kid's in school? Is it the program that's implementing it, and then hence they have to induce cooperation from the Ministry of Education to provide them with the attendance registers to certify compliance, or do you create your own machinery of certifying compliance? In fact, and on what terms do you actually take away benefits? We say this is conditional, but once you're eligible and receiving a check, who really pulls the trigger and stops an otherwise poor and needy mother from getting a check because her 15-year-old wouldn't show up to 8th grade? It's a hard decision to make. Who makes that decision, how it gets made? But the point being, on each of those dimensions, we have a multitude of options. Sometimes 2 options, sometimes 3 options, which means, a CCT is like saying a car. But there isn't a car. There's a specific car into which there are thousands of possible CCTs. A CCT is a description of a class of interventions, not the description of an intervention. And to get from the class of interventions to a specific intervention, we have to make all kinds of decisions. So knowing that Progressa worked to increase average attendance of Mexican kids by 1 year, is completely, it's a metaphor, it's a slogan. It's not actual concrete helpfulness to people who need to do it. They need to design it, kind of take into the context. And that's even more true when we're outside of the realm of the logistical. Once we get into anything that involves routine exercise of discretionary authority by government agents in order to successfully accomplish purposes, which is what Michael and I have called in previous papers transaction-intensive, locally discretionary action. The realm of alternatives and the range of outcomes that could come from policy design is hugely infinite. And one of the things we've learned from randomized evaluations is that oftentimes, the best designed ones don't have any impact just because they don't have any impact. Meaning, there's a great paper called Band-Aids on a Corpse about, a program that was meant to incentivize nurses to show up at the low-level clinics in India, set up this whole thing, and it had all the, it was designed by researchers at MIT and an NGO that had been working in the Indian context for years and years, and basically it didn't have any impact on the teacher's attendance, because they couldn't, in fact, make the administrative apparatus record whether or not the nurses were in attendance. And so what happened is recorded absence in the juridical sense of the absence criteria on which the incentive was going to be paid went down. So that's good. Except physical presence at the clinic also went down. So, in other words, there were fewer nurses actually there if you showed up, but the number of nurses recorded as being absent for the purposes of dinging them on their pay in an incentive way if they weren't there went down. And, if you think, well, either they were there or they weren't there, you clearly haven't worked in the Indian bureaucracy for any length of time. Because clearly there are other options. And the other option was, called away for duty on other services, which your supervising superior in the organization could certify that you weren't physically present, but you weren't absent for the purposes of dinging your pay because you were doing something else. And that category just exploded, such that you now had, you no longer had an absence problem, but you had a worse attendance problem, right? Now, what did we learn from that? Well, we didn't learn anything about the relationship between performance pay and attendance per se, because we never got to the position where performance was actually linked to pay. What we learned was we can't implement this program in the Indian context, right? Now, that's kind of interesting, but it took a long, long time and a lot of effort to come to a conclusion that might have been not so obvious, and maybe had, instead of launching onto a particular instance of a particular program to evaluate its impact, if we had launched into a more collaborative endeavor with trying out various things over the course of 2 or 3 years, learning what could in fact make this work, and then evaluating the end product, doing a big E impact evaluation from intervention to outcome all the way through the causal chain at the end of a process of iterating around, we might have come up with a program that did work to increase nurse attendance. Instead, what we learned was we can't implement a program that would, if implemented, lead to better nurse attendants, we think in theory. So, devil or devil advocate, enough of that? So, the basic point being, I think, useful evaluation, if we want more useful evaluations in the world, we have to make sure they're useful to the people who actually have faith in what they're doing. We can't ask the Pope to randomize on petitionary prayer. And, you know, what's happened essentially is lots of the randomized evaluations that are happening are no longer actually happening with the organizations responsible for implementation. Researchers are getting money, they're implementing things with essentially their own implementation apparatus, finding what works when they do it, and the only rigorous evidence we have about whether that works is that it doesn't. So we do have a rigorous study that took a rigorous study, done where the implementation was reasonably closely controlled by the researchers, found a finding that if we do it this way, teachers show up more and learning goes up, and then replicated exactly that same program as best as possible with the actual Minister of Education. And since the Minister of Education didn't do the first one, we didn't know whether that would work. And it turns out when they replicated it, they did it in two different ways. One in which they had an NGO replicate it, and one in which they had the government replicate it. The one in which the NGO replicated the previous study, they got exactly the same result. And the one in which the government scaled it up and replicated it, they got no impact on learning at all. Which means, one of the things about implementation context is, did the organization actually, are you doing it in the organization you expect to do it in the future? And it's not even clear scientific findings about impact of programs are replicable across context, where context includes the organization doing the implementation, which is difficult, because then if we demonstrate the efficacy of certain programs by using our control over the implementation of apparatus to get around the implementation problem, we end up with findings that don't necessarily have any implications for the actual implementation. So, which is how we get to PDIA, and which is where I'll conclude.
Thanks. I mean, I wasn't quite sure whether you were the devil or the devil's advocate, but I think that's exactly the role you wanted. So let me open this up for questions now, but before that, I'm going to sort of take the liberty of having the mic in hand to just say a couple of things and maybe pose a couple of questions to Bob and Lant. So I think we heard a lot of, maybe this will work and some people think this does, but actually it doesn't. And just to give you a different context where people had a lot of similar discussion, I think in the last couple of weeks, was around the Nobel Prize in Economics this year. So there were a lot of, at least suddenly, social media style articles written about the fact that economics is a completely crazy science. They've given prize to 3 people who have said exactly the opposite thing. So you have Pharma from Chicago saying markets are efficient and they work well, and you have Rob Schiller saying irrational bubbles occur. And this is a sign of a discipline that is completely out of control and has no bearing to science at all. And in some ways, I think a little bit of a discussion sometimes among people doing development sounds a bit like that, of saying, these are people who are just completely ideological and driven by different views. Economists, I think their response was that the fact that people come to different conclusions doesn't mean that it was any single one of them was corrupted. You have a set of counterfactuals, you have a process being set up, and clear conditions under which you can make predictions whether markets will be efficient or they will be irrational, or at what extent they will happen. And I think it's a bit similar when we think about policy design. In some sense, I feel this session was a session about thinking about what makes for smart policy design, and where exactly, if anywhere, should what we think about evaluations fit in. And what I took away from what Bob said, and I think that's something a long-winded way of getting the question, when I looked at your version 2, in some sense, it looked like a fleshed-out version of version 1, where you're saying, we're going to bring many people to the table, we're going to think about design together, we're going to think about what possible alternatives are there. Some people won't come to the table, as you said, in sort of countries that are politically complicated or problematic, but those, when we do, and we have some hypotheses about what to be tested, presumably you're going to need some way of understanding whether it worked. How do you prevent processes of just groupthink emerging where we all want this to work? The only people who are going to come to the table, as Lant said, are going to be a set of people who agree that yes, the policy being put forth is one that we'd love to have. So it didn't seem to me that this was a process that actually says that you're not going to need evidence or you're not going to need something, at least as a potential mechanism, maybe just from the outside, maybe from the inside, to actually know when we are entering processes of groupthink versus responses. So in that sense, I felt your version 2 is a version of saying we need to go the whole way through. I think where many people would agree, we don't want to be anymore in the sort of end game program evaluation stage. There is some program that exists there, and we'll walk in and give the, check up or down, this works or doesn't work. So I think sort of the question is, in that version 2, where is the point at which you see evidence or evaluation, or do you actually see version 2 being one where you would say we will move completely to this process of thinking through using cases, but then not having necessarily any way of knowing what the counterfactual would have posed? I think Lant would ask a question that I think Lant would love if no one else does, which is, what should I think of as useful? You made in some ways a very strong statement of useful. Like, I think about, I choose to do what I do precisely because it's mostly useless. But sort of more seriously, when we think about sort of knowledge generation, it's not clear how immediately you want to kind of use these metrics one wants to use of usefulness. As you gave this example of the study on nurses, just to make a plug for one of our colleagues, Rima Hanna had just completed a very impressive study on a very similar issue done at scale with the government in consultation, building on exactly this and other studies that have occurred. And one of the biggest successes of their study has actually been that this was a government, and in fact across India, who was about to roll out exactly this performance pay program, and by doing an evaluation, they actually have stopped it. So, at scale. So again,
They've stopped it.
Yeah. So, what do you think? What is the metric we should use for usefulness? But let me open up for a couple more questions, and then you can collect them and answer them, since I know we are up against it.
Anybody would like to answer the first question?
Sure.
Questions? We spoke for too long, so.
Red Sox.
Red Sox,
Yeah,
exactly.
we're getting ready for and also Matt has the unenviable task of trying to close this off, Matt. That's going to be good. So, analysis without process can be sterile, and process without analysis can be ranting or emoting or something else happens. We have plenty of examples where I remember talking to a friend of mine when we were trying to set up this little company that would work on these very hard problems together, and he said, if I have to go to another conference, if I had $1 for every conference I'd gone to about where people got up and shared their laments, their solutions, in an evidence-free and non-judgmental environment, he said, I'd be a very rich man and I wouldn't want to go to another one. So that's not what we're talking about. It's not a group therapy session. It's not a consensus-building session per se. It's an effort to use the evidence we have from Policy Analysis 1.0, which includes things that you teach here. The decision analysis, modeling of complex systems, thinking about the role of incentives in agents' choices, and so forth. Building abstractions of a particular problem that we're working on, that puzzle we're working on in a government or an agency, and then bringing that's the model or framework I was telling you about. What is our social scientific knowledge, if you will, if we get bold enough to present that to people in some usable way, coupled with real examples of things that look like improvements in contexts as difficult as ours, and again, theory-inspired data about how we stand in these situations. That's my particular trick that I'm using. I have one more I'd like to suggest to you that is lots of fun and it's been very successful. And this is the imaginary news story. So I write before I get there an imaginary news story of 5 years from now. Here's East Timor's great success. So I did this last week or 2 weeks ago in Thailand. Okay? Thailand 5 years from now with imaginary data, imaginary quotes, And then it says after 1.5 pages or so, it says continued on page A19, but there is no page A19. And then everybody in the room reads a sentence. And it goes around, people pulling out their reading glasses, And at the end, they applaud. Remember at East Timor, they said, no one has ever showed us that we could succeed. It's always been, we have these problems and these constraints and bottlenecks, and we're just stuck where we are. And then you have them go on, I'll just go on 1 minute on this. Then you say to people, this is the appreciative inquiry trick. Then you say to Michael, Michael, I want you to sit down over 5 minutes and imagine a chain of events which would get us from now to then, some of which are hinted at in the case or in this news story. And then I want you to share them with Nick. And Nick, I want you to share your ideas with Michael. And then Michael's going to report back to the whole group Nick's best idea, in his opinion. And Nick reports back Michael's best idea, and I write them on the board here. And then we all appreciate those great ideas. And then we say, so what do we have to do now in the next 6 months to make something happen that goes in these directions? And that is a tremendously creative process. That's not quite the evidence, but we have to have that model, the data, and the example, I think, have to be carefully chosen, and they could be chosen maliciously or dishonestly. But our task as excellent policy analysts and social scientists is to bring the best of those things we can possibly bring to people, not to tell them, do B, because it works, Rory did it, but to inspire them to think through their own situation in ways that we couldn't do.